The night she died, police said the town could finally sleep. They had their man. The science was clear. But then, it happened again. Same town, same signature, same blood on the walls. Only this time, their killer was already in prison, which meant the real killer had never stopped, and an innocent man paid for it. If the science was wrong, how many others did it destroy? Harlan Falls, Iowa. Population, 6,200. The kind of town where the high school football coach had been the same man for 23 years. Where the diner on Clement Street served the same breakfast special it always had. Where people waved at strangers because strangers were rare enough to deserve acknowledgement. Nothing major ever happened in Harlan Falls. The police department ran on a staff of 11. The most serious call any of them regularly handled was a fender bender on Route 9 or an argument that spilled out of Denny's bar on a Friday night. Chief Dennis Pruitt had been with the department for 31 years. He knew every address on the map. He knew which dogs barked at night and which neighbors kept odd hours. He thought he knew everything there was to know about Harlan Falls. He was about to discover how wrong he was. Sandra Kowalski was 44 years old. She worked the morning shift at Harlan Falls Community Bank, where she'd been a loan officer for 11 years. She coached her niece's soccer team on weekends. She grew tomatoes and raised beds in her backyard every summer and gave them away to neighbors because she could never eat them all herself. She lived alone since her divorce 6 years earlier. Her 2 children were grown, one in college, one working in Des Moines. She was, by every account, exactly the kind of person Harlan Falls was built for. A person who knew her neighbors, trusted them, left her back door unlocked when she was expecting her sister for dinner. On the evening of March 14, 2003, Sandra Kowalski did not answer her sister's knock. Her sister waited, knocked again, called her cell phone. Then she tried the back door. It was unlocked. What she found inside changed Harlan Falls forever. When investigators arrived, they documented everything methodically. The point of entry, the layout of the rooms, the position of the body, and then there was the blood on the walls, not just pooled on the floor, sprayed, distributed in patterns across 2 walls of the living room with a consistency that immediately caught the attention of the lead investigator. Detective Ray Calloway was the most experienced officer on the Harlan Falls force. He'd attended 2 seminars on forensic evidence. He'd read the manuals. He trusted what he'd been taught, and what he'd been taught told him that blood patterns like these meant something. They told a story. He just needed someone who spoke the language. The county prosecutor, Martin Greaves, called in a blood spatter analyst from outside the region. Dr. Leonard Ackman had testified in 47 criminal cases across 6 states. He had never, as far as anyone had documented, been successfully challenged in court. He spent 4 hours at the scene. He measured, he photographed, he sketched. And when he was done, he told Detective Calloway exactly what the blood on the walls meant. He told him who had been standing where. He told him how the events had unfolded. He told him, with absolute certainty, what kind of person they were looking for. He spoke with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong. And in Harlan Falls on March 15, 2003, no one had any reason to doubt him. In the days following Sandra Kowalski's murder, Detective Calloway's investigation moved quickly. Too quickly, some would later argue. Marcus Ellery was 38 years old. He lived on the eastern edge of town in a rental house on Grover Road. He worked as a delivery driver for a regional supply company. He kept to himself. He had a prior arrest, a bar fight in 2001 that resulted in a misdemeanor charge and a fine he'd paid off in 6 months. He had known Sandra Kowalski. They had attended the same church for 3 years. They had spoken at events. They had at one point a disagreement, a minor property dispute involving a shared fence that escalated into a short, uncomfortable confrontation. In a murder investigation with no clear suspect, a minor dispute becomes something else entirely. It becomes motive. His name entered the investigation on day 3. By day 7, he was the investigation. This is what investigators call tunnel vision. It doesn't happen because detectives are corrupt. It happens because the human mind is built for pattern recognition. Once a narrative feels right, the brain begins collecting evidence that confirms it, and unconsciously dismissing evidence that doesn't. Every detail of Marcus Ellery's life was now interpreted through a single question: how does this connect him to the murder? Other leads were quietly deprioritized. A witness who reported seeing an unfamiliar truck near Sandra's house that evening. A neighbor who mentioned Sandra had mentioned feeling watched in the weeks before her death. An ex-boyfriend from 3 counties away with a documented history of violence. These threads existed. They were never pulled. When investigators asked Dr. Ackman to review evidence collected from Marcus Ellery's property, he found what they were hoping for. Trace evidence that he argued was consistent with the crime scene, and he revisited his original blood spatter analysis with Marcus Ellery as the subject. In court, he would testify that the patterns on Sandra Kowalski's walls were consistent with someone of Marcus's height and build. That the angle of impact suggested a right-handed assailant. Marcus was right-handed. That the distribution of patterns indicated the attacker had been in the room at a specific position, a position consistent with someone of Marcus's physical profile. Let's pause here, because this is where the science becomes the problem. Blood spatter analysis works like this. When blood leaves a wound during an act of violence, it travels through the air before landing on a surface. The size of the droplet, its elongation, and the tail it leaves are supposed to indicate the direction of travel. Multiple droplets can theoretically help analysts estimate where the violence occurred. The theory sounds reasonable. The problem is the gap between the theory and how it's applied. Real crime scenes are chaotic. Surfaces are uneven. Blood encounters furniture, fabric, and complex architecture before it lands. Bodies move. Victims don't fall in predictable directions. Violence is not choreographed. The National Academy of Sciences, in a landmark 2009 report on forensic science, explicitly stated that blood spatter analysis had not been developed into a mature forensic science. There were no standardized protocols, no universal testing requirements, no peer-reviewed body of research confirming that trained analysts could reliably reconstruct events from blood patterns. Studies have repeatedly shown that when multiple blood spatter analysts examine the same crime scene photographs, they regularly reach different conclusions. Not slightly different, fundamentally different. But Dr. Leonard Ackman testified with certainty. He always did. And in Harlan Falls, Iowa, in the fall of 2003, certainty was exactly what everyone wanted. The trial of Marcus Ellery lasted 9 days. Prosecutor Martin Greaves presented Dr. Ackman as his centerpiece witness. The diagrams were impressive, color-coded, labeled with technical terminology, backed by a man who had testified in 47 cases and spoke with the fluency of someone who had never once doubted himself. Marcus's defense attorney, a general practice lawyer named Gerald Birch, who handled mostly real estate and family law, did not have access to an independent blood spatter expert. He cross-examined Ackman as best he could. Ackman deflected every challenge with technical language and institutional confidence. The jury watched Birch try. They watched Ackman rebuff him. They drew their own conclusions. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Marcus Ellery was convicted of the first-degree murder of Sandra Kowalski. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He said nothing. He had been saying he didn't do it since the moment he was arrested. By then, no one was listening anymore. Marcus Ellery arrived at Iowa State Correctional Facility in January 2004. He was 39 years old. He had never been to prison before. The first weeks were the hardest, not because of danger, though that existed, but because of the disorientation, the complete removal of every choice that had previously defined his life. He wrote letters to his sister in Wisconsin, to a few friends who still believed him, to attorneys whose names he'd found through the prison library. The letters were mostly unanswered, or answered with the bureaucratic politeness that institutions use to close doors without admitting they're closing them. He appealed his conviction in 2005. It was denied. He appealed again in 2008. Denied. He was running out of legal options. He was running out of people who were willing to keep listening, but he never stopped saying it. I didn't do this. And slowly he began to understand something. The case against him had not been built on witness testimony. It had not been built on physical evidence connecting him to the scene. It had been built almost entirely on Dr. Leonard Ackman's interpretation of blood patterns on a wall. He didn't know yet how to challenge it, but he was learning. In February 2009, Marcus was sitting in the common room when the local news program he watched every evening showed a familiar word: Harlan Falls. He moved closer to the screen. A woman had been murdered in Harlan Falls, and as the details emerged, the location, the nature of the crime, something cold moved through him. The reporter described the crime scene. She described the way the room had been left. She described what police were calling a distinctive signature that indicated a specific type of perpetrator. He had heard those exact phrases before. At his own trial, he had been in prison since 2004. He was standing in a correctional facility 60 miles from Harlan Falls. He could not have done this, which meant whatever pattern the police had seen on Sandra Kowalski's walls in 2003 was still being made by someone who was free, someone who had been free the entire time. He wrote 2 letters that night, one to a journalist whose name he'd seen on an article about wrongful convictions, a woman named Carol Vance who wrote for a regional magazine and had spent 3 years covering exoneration cases, one to the Midwest Innocence Coalition, a nonprofit legal organization he'd read about in a news clipping his sister had sent him. He'd written letters before. This time felt different. This time there was something concrete to point to. This time the evidence wasn't just his word against a blood spatter diagram. This time there was a second crime scene that the blood spatter expert could not explain away. Carol Vance almost didn't open the letter. She received dozens from people in prison every year. But something in the specificity of his argument made her keep reading. He wasn't claiming he'd been framed. He wasn't making emotional appeals. He was making a logical argument. The evidence used to convict him was a blood spatter expert's interpretation. A second murder had occurred while he was in prison, with characteristics that prosecutors in his own case had described as unique to his crime. Either the characteristics weren't unique, which undermined the original expert's testimony, or the real killer was still free. Either way, the conviction deserved scrutiny. Carol requested the original trial documents. She read Ackman's testimony. She read the diagrams, the technical language, the absolute certainty. And then she started calling scientists. Dr. Patricia Osei was a forensic scientist at the University of Nebraska. She had published peer-reviewed research on the reliability of blood spatter analysis. She was not interested in dramatic courtroom battles. She was interested in whether the science worked. Carol sent her the original crime scene photographs and Ackman's full testimony. Dr. Osei spent 3 weeks reviewing them. Her findings were careful and specific, and they were damning. First, Ackman's claim that blood spatter patterns could identify the height and build of the attacker had no peer-reviewed scientific basis. The relationship between blood patterns and physical characteristics of perpetrators had not been validated in controlled studies. Second, his assertion that the patterns pointed to a right-handed attacker was similarly unsupported. Handedness cannot be reliably determined from blood spatter patterns. The research simply doesn't exist to support that conclusion. Third, the visual aids used in Marcus's trial, the color-coded diagrams and overlays, were not recreations of the evidence. They were interpretive illustrations of Ackman's theory. They presented a conclusion as though it were a self-evident fact. A jury shown those diagrams was not seeing the evidence. They were seeing Ackman's interpretation of the evidence, dressed up to look like certainty, presented by a man confident enough to make them believe it. In my professional opinion, she wrote, the blood spatter testimony in the Ellery case overstated the reliability of the method to a degree that constitutes a material misrepresentation of forensic science. A material misrepresentation, not a mistake, not a difference of opinion, a misrepresentation. Attorney James Whitmore of the Midwest Innocence Coalition had spent 11 years working wrongful conviction cases. He had seen blood spatter evidence misused before, but the combination of Marcus's case, the second murder, the expert's overreach, the absence of any other substantive evidence, made it one of the strongest he'd reviewed. He filed for post-conviction relief in 2011. He submitted Dr. Osei's report. He submitted comparative analysis of the 2003 and 2009 crime scenes. He submitted documentation showing that the 2009 murder had characteristics that prosecutors in Marcus's original trial had called distinctive to his case. The prosecution responded that the conviction was sound, that Dr. Ackman was qualified, that the new murder was unrelated. The initial hearing was denied. Whitmore appealed, a second court reviewed, and then, slowly, something shifted. In March 2013, the Iowa Court of Criminal Appeals agreed to hear Marcus Ellery's case. Whitmore presented Dr. Osei's testimony. He walked the court through the specific claims Ackman had made and the specific ways current forensic science could not support them. He presented evidence connecting the 2009 murder to the 2003 crime. He did not ask the court to find Marcus innocent. He asked the court to find that the forensic testimony used to convict him was scientifically unreliable, and that without it, no reasonable jury would have returned a guilty verdict. The court deliberated for 6 weeks. They ruled that Dr. Ackman's testimony had overstated the scientific validity of blood spatter analysis in ways that materially affected the outcome of the trial. They ruled that Marcus Ellery had not received a fair trial. The conviction was overturned. A new trial was ordered. Without Ackman's blood spatter testimony, the prosecution had almost nothing. No physical evidence, no witnesses, no confession. They declined to retry. In September 2013, after 9 years and 7 months in Iowa State Correctional Facility, Marcus Ellery walked out of prison. He was 48 years old. The movies show exoneration as a moment of triumph, tearful reunions, clear skies, resolution. The reality is more complicated. Marcus was 48. He had no recent employment history. He had no savings. The rental market, the job market, and the technology around him had all changed substantially during his years inside. His sister welcomed him, but relationships that survive prison do so, carrying the weight of everything that happened. They're not the same relationships. They're reconstructed ones. He eventually found work with a wrongful conviction advocacy organization. He became one of the people who answers the letters like the ones he used to write. He does not describe himself as a survivor. He describes himself as someone who got lucky. Lucky that Carol Vance opened his letter. Lucky that Dr. Osei agreed to review the case. Lucky that James Whitmore took it on. Lucky that the court was willing to look. Not everyone is that lucky. Sandra Kowalski's family spent 9 years believing her killer was in prison. They had grieved. They had found something resembling peace. The overturning of Marcus's conviction didn't just mean an innocent man went free. It meant their closure had been built on something false. It meant the person who killed Sandra had been free for 9 years, and despite renewed investigation, had not been identified. Sandra Kowalski's murder remains officially unsolved. Her family is still waiting. That is also the cost of getting it wrong. Blood spatter analysis is not inherently fraudulent. Used carefully with appropriate acknowledgement of its limitations, it can provide useful investigative information. The problem is not the tool. The problem is how the tool has been used. The Innocence Project has documented that faulty forensic science contributes to approximately 25% of wrongful convictions in the United States. The 2009 National Academy of Sciences report on forensic science found that blood pattern analysis, like several other forensic disciplines, had not been validated by sufficient scientific research. And yet for decades, experts testified about blood spatter patterns with a certainty the underlying science did not support. Juries believed them. Judges allowed it. Prosecutors relied on it. And some of those convictions have never been reviewed because the people serving them don't have a journalist who opened their letter, or a scientist willing to spend 3 weeks reviewing old photographs, or a lawyer with the resources to take it to appeals court. We don't know how many there are. We should want to know. A pattern of blood on a wall. It was treated as a story, a readable text, a map pointing straight to one man. And once that story was told with enough confidence, almost nothing could challenge it. Not new murders, not new science, not 9 years of a man insisting he was innocent. This is what tunnel vision does. This is what junk science enables. And this is why these stories need to be told. Subscribe for more carefully researched stories about wrongful convictions, junk science, and the real human cost of a system that sometimes values certainty more than truth. Science should find the truth. When it doesn't, the truth still waits. It just takes too long.